She did not remember the last time she had felt grass beneath her feet. There was only dust, fine as milled flour, that coated the cracked skin of her soles and puffed up between her toes with every shiver. The dust was a shroud for the town, for the day, for the life she once thought she had. It clung to the ragged hem of her dress, a garment so worn it felt more like a memory of cloth than cloth itself. 3 children were the anchors that kept her from floating away on the wind. 2 boys, twins with their father's dark hair and their mother's quiet eyes, flanked her. The youngest, a girl with hair the color of sun-bleached straw, was asleep in her lap, a small, warm weight against the hollow ache in her belly. They were a tiny, desolate island in the sea of public judgment. The post she was tied to was rough against her back. The rope was not tight enough to cause pain, only to signify ownership, or rather, the lack of it. She was property in arrears, a debt left behind by a man who had chosen a bottle over his promises and, finally, a shallow grave over his shame. The townspeople of Redemption Creek looked on, their faces a gallery of pity, scorn, and a weary indifference that was somehow the cruelest of all. A man named Brant, whose prosperity was measured in the shine of his boots and the cruelty of his smile, stepped forward. He had been her husband's creditor. Now he was hers. He circled her like a coyote assessing livestock. "A sorry sight," he announced to the gathered crowd, his voice oiled with false sympathy. "A woman and her litter, left with nothing. The cost of a fool's wager." She kept her eyes fixed on a loose thread on her son's cuff. To look up was to drown. The crowd murmured. A woman in a starched apron shook her head. A blacksmith wiped his hands on his leather apron, his interest already waning. This was just another Tuesday's sorrow, and there was iron to be bent. From the edge of the small crowd, another man watched. He was built of different material than Brant. Where Brant was polished and loud, this man was weathered and silent. His coat was the color of the dust that covered everything, his boots scuffed and worn from work, not show. He carried whole winters in his eyes, a landscape of loss that she recognized, even from a distance. He leaned against the rail of the general store, motionless, a part of the tired scenery. Brant gestured grandly. "Her husband owed me a considerable sum. I am a patient man, but business is business. I'll take the wagon, the tools, and her. She can work it off. In my kitchens. Her children, too, when they're old enough to be useful." A flicker of movement from the woman. Her hand tightened on her sleeping daughter's back. It was the only protest she could make. The silent man pushed himself off the railing. He did not stride. He moved with an economy born of long days and tired muscles. The dust barely seemed to stir at his feet. He walked not to the center, but to the side, his gaze fixed on Brant. "What was the debt?" The man's voice was low, like it came from under floorboards. It was not a voice used to making pronouncements. Brant turned, annoyed by the interruption. He squinted at the man. "Silas, still haunting this town? The debt is $100. More than she's worth, I'd wager," he laughed. A short, ugly sound. Silas's expression did not change. He reached into the deep pocket of his coat, his movements slow, deliberate. He pulled out a worn leather pouch that looked heavy. He didn't open it. He just held it. "I'll take it," Silas said. "Not a question. A statement." Brant's smile faltered. "Take what?" "The debt." "The debt," Silas confirmed. "And them?" He gave a slight nod toward the woman and her children. He did not look at her, a small mercy she hadn't known she needed. To be looked at was to be appraised. He was looking at the transaction. Brant's eyes narrowed, shifting from Silas to the pouch and back again. Greed warred with pride. Pride wanted the woman to serve as a public lesson. Greed wanted the hard currency. Greed won. $100, Silas? For that. He waved a dismissive hand. "It settles his account," Silas said. He tossed the pouch. It landed in the dust at Brant's feet with a heavy, final clink. "Now cut her loose." Brant stared at the pouch, then at Silas's unreadable face. He hesitated, then bent to retrieve his money. He straightened, his face flushed with a mixture of profit and humiliation. He pulled a knife from his belt and, with a flick of his wrist, severed the rope that held the woman to the post. The rope fell away. She felt a strange lightness, a dizzying sense of being untethered from the only solid thing in her world. She swayed, her arms wrapping tighter around her children. Silas had already turned away, walking toward a sturdy wagon hitched nearby. He did not offer a hand. He did not offer a word of comfort. He just stopped beside the wagon and looked back at her, his gaze finally meeting hers for a brief, startling moment. There was no pity in his eyes. There was something else, a shared understanding of fissures in the soul. "Get in my wagon now," he said, his voice quiet but carrying in the sudden stillness. Then he turned his attention to checking the harness, as if the matter was concluded. The journey was a long, rattling silence. The sun beat down, turning the dust lifted by the wheels into a cloud of pale ghosts that followed them. The woman sat in the back of the wagon, her children huddled close. They were small and still, their eyes wide with the shock of the day's sharp turns. She held them, her body a shield against the jolts of the rough track and the terrifying uncertainty of the horizon. Silas did not look back. He sat straight, his hands steady on the reins, his focus on the two horses and the endless, dun-colored land ahead. He was a silhouette against the bleached sky, a man who seemed to be carved from the very loneliness of the landscape. Hours passed. The sun began its slow, bleeding descent toward the jagged teeth of the western mountains. The air grew cooler. The little girl in her lap stirred and whimpered, her face hot with thirst. Without turning, Silas reached behind him, holding out a metal canteen. The gesture was spare, functional. She hesitated for a moment, her pride a brittle thing. Then she saw the cracked lips of her son, and she took it. The water was cool and tasted of iron and stone. She gave it to the boys first, then drank a little herself before waking her daughter to drink. When she was done, she held it out. Silas took it without a word and hung it back on its hook. It was the first kindness she had received in a very long time, and it was so unspoken, so practical it did not feel like charity. It felt like a necessity, like breathing. They arrived as dusk was settling, painting the landscape in shades of bruised purple and deep indigo. The house was not what she expected. It was not a grand ranch house, but a simple, solid structure of hewn logs and river stone, weathered to a silver gray. It stood alone in a shallow valley, sheltered by a stand of gnarled cottonwoods. It was a place built for endurance, not for comfort. It looked as isolated as the man who lived in it. A single light burned in a window, a small yellow square against the encroaching dark. Silas reined in the horses. The creak of the wagon and the jingle of the harness were the only sounds. He climbed down, his movements stiff. He did not help her down, but he waited until she had gathered her children and her courage and climbed over the side, her feet touching the cool, solid earth of his land. He led them to the door and pushed it open. The house exhaled a scent of wood smoke, old books, and something else, a long-settled emptiness. The main room was spare. A stone fireplace, cold and black. A sturdy table with 2 chairs. A shelf of books. Everything was clean, ordered, but unused. It was the home of a man who did not so much live in a space as occupy it. He pointed toward a closed door. "That room. It was my wife's. It's yours now," he paused, his gaze going to the floorboards. "There are beds. Linens in the chest." She nodded, unable to form words. She gathered her children, who clung to her like burrs. He moved to the fireplace, striking a match. The flame flared, catching on the kindling he had laid. "There's stew in the pot on the hearth. Bread in the box. Eat." He turned back to her, his shadow leaping up the wall behind him, huge and protective. "I don't lock doors here," he said, his voice low and steady. "You have no reason to be afraid of me." And with that, he took his coat from a peg by the door and went back outside, leaving her and her children in the sudden, startling warmth of the firelight. She stood there, listening to the crackle of the flames, the soft breathing of her children, and the vast, open silence of the land outside. She had been bought, but for the first time in a very long time, she did not feel like property. She felt safe. The days settled into a rhythm, quiet and unhurried. It was a language spoken not in words, but in shared tasks. She rose before the sun, the chill of the floorboards a sharp reminder of where she was. She would find firewood stacked by the door, a bucket of fresh water from the well already drawn. He was always gone by then, a ghost who left offerings of work and sustenance. She learned the geography of the house, the way a certain floorboard groaned under the table, the way the morning light cut a clean line across the dusty floor. She swept the dust away, not because she was told, but because it felt like sweeping away the past. The dust of Redemption Creek had no place here. Her first attempt at baking bread in his oven was a disaster. The loaf came out hard as a rock, blackened on the bottom. When Silas came in from the fields that evening, he saw it on the table. He picked it up, weighed it in his hand, and set it back down. He said nothing, just sat and ate the stew she had made, which was thin but hot. The next morning, a sack of new flour sat by the oven. Tucked into the top was a small, carved wooden bird. She held it in her palm, its lines smooth and simple, a gift of correction, not criticism. That evening the bread was better. He ate 2 slices. "A little dry," he said, his eyes on his plate. "You didn't complain about mine," came a small voice. It was one of the twins, Micah. He spoke so rarely she started. Silas looked at the boy, a flicker of something in his wintry eyes.
"No.
"I didn't." She learned the shape of his grief. There was a small, fenced-off plot on the hill behind the house. A simple wooden cross marked it. Some days, she would see him standing there as the sun went down, his hat in his hands, his shoulders slumped. One afternoon, while he was out mending a fence on the far pasture, she took a single, stubborn wildflower that had pushed its way up through the hard-packed earth by the porch and placed it at the base of the cross. She did not know the name of the woman buried there, but she knew the shape of her absence. When Silas returned, he said nothing. But the next day, a third chair appeared at the table. It was smaller, clearly handmade, the wood still pale and new. He had made it for her daughter, Sarah. The children began to thaw. They explored the barn, their hushed whispers filling the hay-scented air. They discovered a creek and spent afternoons chasing minnows. The fear slowly receded from their eyes, replaced by the natural curiosity of the young. Silas never spoke to them directly, but he would leave things for them to find. A perfect skipping stone on the porch rail, an apple polished to a high shine, a nest of abandoned bird eggs placed carefully in a tin can. He was stitching their lives together with raw thread, mending the tears with quiet, calloused hands. One night, a scream tore through the silence of the house. It was hers. She woke up tangled in the sheets, the smell of dust and the jeering face of Brant sharp in her memory. The door to her room creaked open. Silas stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the faint moonlight from the main room. "Don't lock me in," she whispered, the words coming out ragged, a plea from a nightmare she could not escape. He stood there for a long moment, his presence a solid, unmoving thing. "I told you," he said, his voice impossibly gentle. "I don't lock doors." He retreated, leaving the door slightly ajar. She laid back down, her heart still hammering against her ribs, but the fear was different now. It was an echo, not a presence. She listened to the sound of him adding a log to the fire in the other room, the soft thud a promise of warmth and watchfulness. The next day, she found him by the corral, replacing a rotten post. She brought him a cup of water. He took it, his knuckles brushing hers. The touch was brief, accidental, but it sent a tremor through her. He drank the water and handed the cup back. He looked at her, really looked at her, and his eyes were not just landscapes of winter anymore. There was something else in them, a question. "Why?" she asked, the single word costing her more than all the silence of the past weeks. "Why did you take me?" He looked away, toward the vast, empty horizon. He ran a hand over the rough wood of the new post. "My wife, Mary. She would not have stood by and watched," he said. His voice was thick with memory. It wasn't right. What Brant was doing, he paused. And this place, it was too quiet. He turned back to his work, his shoulders set, as if the admission had cost him dearly. She stood there, the empty cup in her hands, the wind whipping a strand of hair across her face. It was too quiet. He had not rescued her from poverty. He had rescued her from silence, and in doing so, he had rescued himself from the same. She went back to the house, and for the first time since her husband's death, she hummed a tune as she kneaded the dough for the evening's bread. It was a broken melody, half-remembered, but it was a start. The house, which had once felt haunted by emptiness, seemed to breathe with her. The peace was a fragile thing, a skin of ice over deep water. She knew it. He knew it. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath. The first sign was the dust cloud on the horizon, too purposeful for a stray gust of wind. It was riders, 3 of them. She was hanging laundry on the line, the white sheets snapping in the wind like signal flags. When she saw them, her hands went still. The clothespins fell from her grasp into the basket. Her heart, which had learned a slower rhythm, began to hammer a frantic, familiar beat against her ribs. Silas was in the barn, sharpening an axe blade. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone stopped. He had seen them too. He emerged from the shadows of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He did not look at her, but she felt his gaze, a silent question. "Are you all right?" She nodded, a small, tight movement, and began gathering her children, herding them toward the house with a low, urgent voice. "Inside, now. Play by the fire." They scurried past her, their faces pale, sensing the shift in the air. The wind had turned mean. By the time the riders reached the edge of his property, Silas was standing on the porch, his shotgun held loosely in the crook of his arm, not aimed but present. A statement. She stood just inside the open doorway, a hand on the frame, unable to retreat completely. This was her battleground too. It was Brant, of course. His 2 hired men flanked him, their expressions bored and callous. Brant's face was a mask of smug righteousness. He pulled his horse to a halt a few yards from the porch. "Silas," Brant called out, his voice slick with contempt. "I've come for my property." Silas's face was stone. "You were paid. The debt is settled." "The debt for the man, yes," Brant sneered, "but not for the woman. There was a contract, a verbal one before witnesses. She was to work off his failings. You interfered in a business arrangement. I have a writ from the magistrate. She belongs to me." He held up a piece of paper, waving it like a flag of conquest. "That paper means nothing out here," Silas said, his voice flat and cold as a river stone. "This is my land. She is under my protection." Brant laughed. "Protection? You're either the kindest man I've ever met, Silas, or the most foolish." Hiding away with another man's leavings, his eyes slid past Silas to where she stood in the doorway. His gaze was possessive, stripping her bare with its familiarity. "Come on out, girl. You've had your little holiday. Time to earn your keep." The old fear, cold and sharp, lanced through her. Her breath caught in her throat. Her first instinct was to shrink back, to disappear into the shadows of the house. But then she saw Silas shift his weight, a subtle movement that placed him more squarely between her and Brant. She saw the white of his knuckles on the shotgun. He was not just protecting his land. He was protecting her. Her. Not an object, not a debt, but a person. Something inside her. A thing that had been frozen for months, for years, finally cracked. The fire in the hearth only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. She stepped out from the doorway, moving to stand beside Silas on the porch. The sun was in her eyes, but she did not flinch. She met Brant's gaze, and for the first time, she did not look away. "I am not your property," she said. Her voice was thin from disuse, but it was clear, carried on the wind. It was her own. Brant's smile vanished, replaced by a dark flush of anger. "You'll do as you're told," he made to dismount. "She will not," Silas said. He did not raise the shotgun. He didn't need to. His voice was enough. "You have no claim here, Brant. You were paid. You took the money. Now leave my land." "Or what?" Brant spat, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "You'll shoot me? In front of witnesses? For collecting what's rightfully mine?" Before Silas could answer, she moved. She stepped forward, past Silas, to the edge of the porch steps. She looked up at Brant on his fine horse, and she felt no fear, only a cold, clarifying anger. "He paid you $100, she said, her voice stronger now. "And you took it. The town saw you take it. You have his money. You will not have me." "You insolent—" Brant began, raising a hand as if to strike her. A sharp crack echoed in the valley. It wasn't the shotgun. It was the sound of her hand striking Brant's leather-gloved one as it came down. The force of it shocked them all, most of all her. Brant stared at her, his mouth agape. His hired men shifted uneasily in their saddles. This was not the simple collection they had signed up for. "I said leave," Silas said again, and this time there was a finality to it, a sound like a door being bolted shut. "Before you make me forget that my wife was a God-fearing woman." Brant looked from her defiant face to Silas's unyielding one. He saw the shotgun. He saw the house, solid and impassive behind them. He saw two people who were no longer separate, but a single, unbroken line. His bluster crumbled. There was no profit here, only the potential for pain. He spat in the dust. "Keep her," he snarled, pulling his horse's head around sharply. "You deserve each other." He galloped away, his men trailing behind him, their retreat kicking up a cloud of dust that was quickly torn apart by the wind. They stood on the porch, watching until the riders were nothing more than specks on the horizon. The silence they left behind was different. It was not empty. It was earned. She was trembling, the aftermath of a storm she had weathered. She looked at her hand, the one that had struck Brant, felt like it belonged to someone else. "I was scared," she whispered to the wind. "I know," Silas said, his voice beside her. He finally lowered the shotgun. He looked at her, and the winter in his eyes had broken. There was a warmth there, a deep and profound respect. "You didn't run." "I had nowhere to run to," she said, looking back at the open door of the house. He was quiet for a long moment. "Yes, you did," he said softly. "You ran right here." That evening, the air in the small house was thick with unspoken things. The threat had passed, but it had changed the landscape between them forever. They ate their meal in the flickering firelight, the silence no longer a space to be endured, but a comfort to be shared. Her children, sensing the calm, were asleep in their room, their breathing soft and even. After the table was cleared, Silas sat by the fire, mending a piece of harness leather, his hands sure and steady. She sat in the other chair, darning a hole in her son's sock, the needle moving in and out of the worn wool. The small, domestic sounds filled the space where words were not needed. Finally, he set the harness aside. He looked into the flames, his face etched with light and shadow. "Brant won't be back," he said. It was a promise. She nodded, her needle pausing. "I know." He turned his gaze to her. It was direct, without artifice. "What do they call you?" he asked. His voice was quiet. It was the most important question anyone had ever asked her. He was not asking what her husband had called her, or what the town called her, or what Brant called her. He was asking who she was. She looked down at her hands, at the needle and thread, at the small, sturdy work of mending what was broken. She thought of the woman who had arrived here, a nameless ghost tied to a post. That woman was gone. She had been burned away in the fire of that afternoon's stand. She lifted her chin and met his eyes. "My name is Lena," she said. Silas held her gaze. He gave a slow, small nod, as if he were memorizing the sound of it, fitting it into the empty spaces of the house. Lena, he repeated. The name settled in the room, solid and real. It was a foundation stone. In the days that followed, something shifted. He began to call her by her name. The sound of it in his low voice was a constant affirmation. Lena, the bread is good. Lena, there's a storm coming in. And she, in turn, began to call him Silas. One afternoon, he came to her with a piece of paper and a pen. We should make it official, he said, not looking at her. At the courthouse. So men like Brandt can have no more questions. It was not a proposal of romance, but of fortitude. A marriage of purpose, a fortress built for two. Or rather, for five. She took the pen. Yes, she said. They were married on a Tuesday, the same day of the week she had been tied to the post. The magistrate was a tired man who smelled of stale coffee, but his words were binding. When they walked out into the dusty street of Redemption Creek, the townspeople looked at them differently. They were no longer the strange recluse and the disgraced widow. They were Mr. and Mrs. Silas Blackwood, a fact as solid as the mountains on the horizon. That night, they burned the writ from Brandt in the fireplace. They watched the paper curl and blacken, the arrogant script turning to gray ash. It was a funeral for the past. Life on the ranch continued its rhythm, but the melody had changed. It was richer, fuller. Laughter sometimes echoed in the small house. Her daughter, Sarah, began to follow Silas around the barn, her small hand sometimes finding its way into his large, calloused one. One evening, as he came in for supper, Sarah ran to him, shouting, "Papa Silas, the black hen has 3 new chicks." Silas froze in the doorway. He looked down at the little girl, then up at Lena, who stood by the hearth, her heart in her throat. A complex emotion crossed his face. Grief for the family he had lost, and a fragile, burgeoning joy for the one he had found. He reached down and gently ruffled Sarah's hair. "Is that so?" he said, his voice thick. The house breathed again. It was no longer a monument to what was lost, but a vessel for what was being built. The ghosts were not gone, but they had made room. They never spoke of love. The word was too small for what they had forged in silence and shared labor, in fear and in defiance. Love was the third chair at the table. It was the wildflower on a grave. It was the unbolted door in the dead of night. It was the sound of a name, spoken with respect in a quiet room. One evening, years later, they sat on the porch as they often did, watching the sun set. The sky was a brilliant, impossible blood orange. The children, nearly grown, were finishing chores in the barn, their voices carrying on the cool air. Lena leaned her head back against the post, the wood smooth and familiar against her hair. Silas sat beside her, whittling a small figure, his hands never idle. He held up the piece of wood. It was a bird, more detailed than the first one he had ever given her, its wings poised for flight. He placed it in her hand. She closed her fingers around it, the wood warm from his touch. She looked out at their land, at the solid house, at the fence line stretching out to meet the horizon. It was a life built not from a grand passion, but from 1,000 small, decent acts. A life built from the answer to a single, quiet question. He had not said, "I love you," he had said, "Get in my wagon now," and she had learned, over all this time, that they were the very same thing. This story, it ain't just about rescue. Rescue is loud. It's a moment. This is about something quieter, something that grows in the spaces between words. It's about the kind of strength you find not in shouting, but in standing your ground. It's about how sometimes, the greatest act of love is simply to see a person when no one else is looking, and to offer them not a hand down from on high, but a place to stand beside you. So here's your naming. What do they call you when you're at your lowest? What name do you give yourself when you find the courage to stand up? The world is full of Brandts, full of people who want to tell you what you're worth. They will tie you to posts of their own making, posts of shame or debt or expectation. But a Silas might just be watching. Not a knight in shining armor, but a quiet soul with scars of their own, holding a canteen of cool water. And if you're brave enough to get in that wagon, If you're brave enough to claim your own name when asked, you might just find that you weren't being rescued at all. You were finding the one person in the whole dusty world who knew you were already home.